Good evening. I'm Vilashini Cooppan, Professor of Literature and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Laura Martin, the Program Manager for the Humanities Institute and a lecturer in Porter College. Tonight, we're kicking off one of the Humanities Institute's most popular events, the Deep Read. Every year for the past 5 years, the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz has brought together many thousands of readers. They include UCSC faculty, staff, and students, members of the Santa Cruz community, local and statewide high schools and their teachers, and many more to explore a single book together over several weeks. We'd like to thank the Helen and Will Webster Foundation and our many campus and community partners for their support of the Deep Read. This year's book choice is James by Percival Everett, winner of the 2024 National Book Award and also shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Over the next several weeks, Laura Martin and I, along with several colleagues across the campus, will serve as your guides to James. We have an exciting array of events coming up, and we'll put the link to the website in the chat. These include a craft salon on April 22nd with creative writers, a faculty salon on April 29th with scholars of literature, history, and music, all engaging the novel from different points of view. And this will culminate on May 4th with a conversation between author Percival Everett and myself in the Quarry Amphitheater and also on Zoom. You'll find details of these events on the Humanities Institute website, as well as in the regular reading guide emails that we'll be sending you throughout April to help you along the way. Everett's James is many things. It's a pointed exploration of the structures of racism and race relations in the contemporary US. It's an ironic look at how racial stereotypes obscure us from one another. It's a consideration of the processes through which books become necessary, even canonical, and why that happens and what it means to change that. James accomplishes all of these things and many more by rewriting Mark Twain's late 19th century classic, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We're starting the Deep Read with a closer look at the text that inspired James. We hope to give you a picture of how the foundational text behind James is put together, some of its concerns, how it's composed, how critics have written and thought about it, in order to help you then approach the novel with a sense for its own history and its relevance to the present. Tonight, we're immensely fortunate to have a nationally and internationally recognized Twain scholar to help us understand the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I'd like to introduce Susan Gillman. She is Distinguished Professor of Literature at UC Santa Cruz and the recipient of many national fellowships and honors. She's the author of 2 books on Mark Twain. First, Dark Twins, Imposture and Identity in Mark Twain's America, 1989, and a co-edited volume, Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson, Race, Conflict, and Culture, 1990. Beyond Twain studies, she has published in the field of American and African American studies with Blood Talk, American Race Melodrama and the Culture of the Occult, 2003, and her most recent book in the field of Hemispheric American Studies is American Mediterraneans, a Study in Geography, History, and Race, 2022. Our format tonight will be the following. Professor Gillman will speak to us about Huck Finn for about 30 minutes. This will be followed by 25 minutes or so of discussion with Laura, Susan Gillman, and myself. And finally, we'll open up to you, our audience, for half an hour of questions and answers. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat at any point in the proceedings. We will keep track of the questions and open it up to you. Thank you again for tuning in. And with that, I will turn it over to Susan Gillman.
Thank you, Vilashini. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see. I have a few slides for you so that really for visual purposes, so that you can get a sense of Twain's 19th century. Here we go. So that you can get a sense of Twain's 19th century, our own moment, and the relationship between those two. I was going to call my little half-hour talk Freed, Not Free, because there's so much in Huckleberry Finn and in James about the fragile state of freedom. And so let's start right now with just thinking about remembering slavery again and again based on the fragile state of freedom. Why do we remember when we do? When we confront what Toni Morrison said in an early interview about her neo-slave narrative, Beloved, published in 1987, she said in an early interview in Time magazine, why remember when we do? Something that the characters don't want to remember, I don't want to remember, Black people don't want to remember, white people don't want to remember. I mean, it's national amnesia. So why and when do we keep on forgetting and then remembering again? Or again, to use the words that Morrison made up to refer to this strange process of remembering and forgetting. She talks about it as disremembering and rememory. Both of them are verbs. Plenty of time elapsed historically when there really wasn't much of anything at all in the collective American consciousness about slavery. So I thought I would start us off by thinking about the timeline that starts with Huck Finn's memory of slavery as a novel in the 1890s and the 1880s and 90s, moving forward just to these two other major moments. So starting with Huck Finn in the 1880s, then the Huck Finn birthday, 100 years after its publication in the 1980s, so in 1985, and then ending with James in 2004. And I think you can really see how unfinished this timeline is. There's not much on it at all. I'm hoping that we will get to talk about points on a timeline that you might be interested in putting on here. And in fact, we'll try to put an interactive timeline on the web when we're done. Here's another version of the later, when slavery is remembered in the later period. And I did put some points on this timeline just to give you an idea of what you might be thinking about. The erection of Confederate monuments, which we know about because we are removing them or otherwise taking the names off of them. And there were two moments when Confederate monuments were erected, not at all near the Civil War, but one in the very early part of the 20th century, and then one in the 1940s, right after World War II. We'd want to talk about why is slavery being remembered in that way. And I have a bunch of other ideas on here for that. So these slides, again, are my provisional and intentionally unfinished timelines of why we remember when we do. Why in 1885 did Huck Finn remember the slavery of the 1840s and 50s? And what difference might that make? If we try to start at the beginning of the novel, there are 3 pages of prefatory material, the title page, and a few little notes to the reader, which probably a lot of us skip. So the first one is this title page, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And this reminds us of the distance between the time of the novel setting and its writing. And that is seen as the Mississippi River Valley, time 40 to 50 years ago. So again, reminds us of the fact that the book is written long after slavery. This one, a notice signed by the author per order of the author. Persons attempting to find a moral in the story, a plight in the story will be shot. And then there's this longer explanatory, which is, I think, worth just for a moment looking at. Also signed the author, and he pays attention to his careful precision in the dialects, which I think we just want to note the most important ones are the backwoods, uh, let me, uh, the Missouri Negro dialect and the extreme form of backwoods Southwestern dialect. This brings our attention to the idea of the language of the novel. And only at this point, when Twain has, indulged in his standard humor, I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding. Only at this point do we actually go into the novel proper. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We could talk later about why the "the" is here, but not on the cover. Um, and here we had those three little prefatory pages before the book even begins with this very famous line by the character who's speaking quite cheekily in the first person about his creator. You don't know about me without you've read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was things that he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. Now, this is worth noticing as a frame for the novel, meaning that the author, quote unquote, appears and really quickly disappears. Huck is the narrator of his own story. There's actually no frame at all. We just start right into Huck's voice. This is Mark Twain's radical experiment to drop the usual cultured, educated, standard English speaking figure who would introduce these tales either in frontier humor or Black trickster tales. There would always be a frame narrator who would tell the story around a pot-bellied stove if it was a frontier humor, who would introduce the vernacular narrator who spoke in this uncultured, non-standard English. In this book, there's no narrator at all. It's only Huck. So we get this direct, unadulterated, unmediated contact with Huck's ungrammatical, coarse language, as it was said in the banning of the book from the Concord, Massachusetts Public Library in shortly after the book was published. And that is our connection to the novel, is Huck's own language. Still, I think it's totally understandable to forget from these strange opening salvos, which might seem to us to be barely part of the book, that our quote unquote great American novel about slavery wasn't actually written during slavery at all, but long afterward. 20 years after the Civil War ended, I'm just going to give you a few dates to sort of locate what was happening in the 1880s when the novel was written. 20 years after the Civil War ended in 1865, and in the decade right after what was called Reconstruction, the period from 1866 to 1877, when the Civil War amendments had seemingly resolved the whole matter of the war. And that was the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which we hear about a lot these days, which guaranteed civil rights to the ex-slaves, and the 15th Amendment, which conferred the vote on males, as we know. Reconstruction was the period when those rights were implemented, the experiment in trying to bring the ex-slaves into the nation. Federal troops occupied the South to try to enforce these new amendments, and the experiment in incorporating those ex-slaves really ended in what's thought of as, in 1877, in failure, the withdrawal of the troops, the return of what was called home rule to the South. And this was the prelude, not the end, but the beginning of the long period of legalization of segregation, separate but equal, that was made in the 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. But there were numerous cases leading up to that Supreme Court case, as we know always happens, including in 1883, a series of landmark cases that overturned another one of the civil rights efforts during Reconstruction, which was a set of cases that regulated accommodation in public spaces. And so this is a period of retrenchment in the law, where the rights guaranteed to the slaves in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were gradually constrained, reduced, and removed. For this reason, we can talk later. Huck Finn, you can't think of Huck Finn as an abolitionist or anti-slavery novel the way there were either the slave narratives or, say, Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. So when emancipation was not there yet, Huck Finn is not quite those kinds of works, and we want to think about, well, then what is it? So why would Twain want to remember slavery in the 1880s and 90s? Start with just Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens. Twain, as the pen name that we all remember, comes from his experience as the Cub pilot on the Mississippi. It was a river depth measurement. He was a hugely successful celebrity writer who had married the young daughter of an abolitionist family in upstate New York. Her father was a wealthy coal and timber magnate. Her name was Olivia Langdon, and her father, wealthy enough to allow the new young couple to build a huge mansion in Hartford, Connecticut, 351 Farmington Avenue, for the young couple who had three daughters. They are pictured here on the porch, in that, if you look back here on the porch at the edge of this large mansion. And Twain had come a long way to this celebrity from the house that he grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, um, to a small, very small slaveholding family. It was a slaveholding town. His family did own a very few slaves, and they lived in a modest home in Hannibal, Missouri, in comparison to what he had become at 351 Farmington Avenue. Part of the reason is he was an extremely successful celebrity writer. He was riding the crest of a wave of popular literature, extremely popular literature, on plantations, masters, slaves, a whole range of different kinds of forms and political positions on slavery. They were all written during this period that he's writing. The political positions range from apologist, nostalgic, to the outright critical, by Black writers by and large. Um, and they took the form of, all these books took the form of historical novels, sometimes called historical romances, regional local color sketches, humorous folk tales, especially what was called dialect fiction. Twain was influenced by them all and drew on all of them. And here you can see examples. And I will read a couple of these titles that I think are very telling. George Washington Cable, who will come back into the story in a bit, his hugely popular 1880 The Grandissimes, subtitled A Story of Creole Life. And that was set by this favorite son in his own New Orleans. Um, Another would be Charles Chestnut's Trickster Tales, Black folk tales that he wrote in the collection called The Conjure Woman, 1899. These are similar to Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus tales. There were Black women writers, many who we have now forgotten, but who have been recently been republished. Pauline Hopkins's Contending Forces, subtitled A Romance Illustrative of Negro Life, North and South. And then finally, the most racist writer of all, who was very popular as well, Thomas Dixon's Reconstruction trilogy, um, called one, The Leopard Spots, a romance of the white man's burden. You can tell from the subtitle what these novels are like. And the second one, The Klansman, a historical romance of the KKK, adapted by D.W. Griffith into his very famous film of 1915, Birth of a Nation. Uh, Further, there were works that were set in an invented medieval past at this period, not just in the actual past of the South. And Twain was somewhat out of step with this interest in the invented medieval past. He was in step with so much of his time, but he was also very much an outsider. And he resented the interest in medieval culture. And in his book that in which he went back onto the Mississippi, where he'd been a cub pilot in 1883, called Life on the Mississippi, uh, he blamed Sir Walter Scott. You can see at the bottom of the slide, I'll read this. He blamed Sir Walter Scott, what he called the Sir Walter disease, not only for the Civil War completely, but for the fact that after the Civil War, every other male in the South had some kind of military title. In our South, this is near at the bottom of this picture of the knight on the horse. In our South, the genuine and wholesome civilization of the 19th century is curiously confused and commingled with the Walter Scott middle-aged sham civilization. And it's why Sir Walter Scott made every gentleman in the South a major or a colonel or a judge. This work, I think, leads us to one other that's very important about both James and Huck Finn, and that is another kind of remembering that was happening in the 1880s and 90s, and that was the Civil War itself. 20 years after the Civil War, 1865 to 1885, it is often said that war literature doesn't appear until a whole generation after that war. And here is an example of that holding true. Um, there were, Twain wrote a little story called The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, that was published in a series in Century magazine called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. And I feel like helping us to understand there couldn't be a weirder contribution to this series of pieces by famous generals and unknown privates, a pretty patriotic series. Twain's Private History of a Campaign That Failed, on his very brief, very anti-heroic service in the Confederate Army. You couldn't imagine a weirder contribution to Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. This connects us to both Huck Finn and James because this little story shares very strikingly similar language to Huck Finn, the language of death, stillness, loneliness, that many readers will remember all those very strange little mournful thumbnail autobiographies that Huck makes up, featuring sick or dead families, his whole gloomy substratum of the Huck personality. Then also there are all those dreadful little river towns, one horse river towns, as the novel calls them, that are, the novel says, dead and still like Sunday. This is Huck's language. All still and Sunday-like, so lonesome and like everybody's dead. He hears a spinning wheel wailing, both in Huck Finn and in Private History of the Campaign That Failed, both that mournful spinning wheel wailing associated with the presence of death and mourning. And together, I think these, along with the ever-present threat of death in James, along with the fact that James moves the date of the novel up to, so that the Civil War has already begun, all of this, I think, reflects the historian Drew Gilpin Faust's wonderful book called The Republic of Suffering, where she says the cultural work of death was Civil War America's most fundamental and most demanding undertaking. Both Huck Finn and James represent that cultural work of death aimed at largely at Black slaves in James. In Huck Finn, it's more varied and simply a free-floating form of mournful lonesomeness, again, the gloomy substratum of Huck's personality. All of this, I think, converges in one last historical moment in the 1880s, and that is the tour, the book tour that Cable of the Grandissimes, A Story of Creole Life, and his fellow Southerner Twain took around the country to essentially advertise their two most recent works. Um, Finn was Twain's, and Cable's was an essay in a collection called The Silent South, an essay called The Freedman's Case in Equity. The two, the twins of genius, as it was called, the tour, the two Southerners, the two fellow Southerners, really shared a common subject here, echoed one another. Twain talks a lot about setting a free man free, and I'll look at a couple of those comments from those lines from Huck Finn. And Cable talks about freed, not free. The ex-slaves are freed, not free. His essay, The Freedman's Case in Equity, was written to protest the mistreatment of African Americans at that time. And the end of his essay, like the end of the novel, Huck Finn, here's what Cable says. I just want you to hear this. To be a free man is his still distant goal. Twice he has been a freedman. What need say more? The question is answered. Is the freed man a free man? No. We will seek that plane of universal justice and equity, which it is every people's duty before God to seek, until the whole people of every once slaveholding state can stand up as one man, saying, is the freedman a free man? And the whole world shall answer yes. Across the country, Americans were reading and reacting to Cable's essay that had just appeared with 3 pre-publication installments from Huck Finn in the very same January issue. And you can see I put a little squib from the issue of the Century magazine. This was also where The Battles and Leaders of the Civil War was published. Cable, who was a favorite son of New Orleans, had to leave the city and move to Northampton, Massachusetts for the rest of his life as a result of publishing this essay. Twain performed in that same tour. Cable read from his essay. Twain performed in that same tour a half-hour reading, as they called it, from the novel's last section, that one where Tom, knowing that Jim has already been freed by Miss Watson's deathbed will, holds that information from him and uses Jim to stage what they call the evasion, which is his version of these escapes from prisons that he's read about in The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, etc. So many readers we know recoil from that minstrel show-like performance. Ernest Hemingway hated it. He said to stop reading the novel after Huck decides in the very famous chapter 31 not to turn Jim in and instead go to hell. That's Huck's rendition of his own decision not to turn Jim in, not to allow Jim to be a slave anymore, but to be free once more. The rest, Hemingway said, after that moment, the last 12 chapters, just cheating. And at this point, we have to say, we'll go back to this. Uh, Let me go back to this now. At this point, just before the end of the novel, you can see all of these expressions in which Huck comments on the impossibility of freeing James. Called James later, Jim here, called Jim and James, called here in this novel, Jim's name is misunderstood, misread, missaid several times as well. So here we are with Huck and Jim both talking about being in slave country again. This is actually Jim saying this at chapter 16. What Jim is saying is his fear that if they pass if they make the wrong turn at the town called Cairo, pronounced it's Cairo, the biblical Exodus reference, if they miss the turn at Cairo, a real southern town where the Mississippi meets the Ohio and where you'd go up north, you'd turn on the river. Jim says he'd be a freed man the minute he's seen it, but if he missed it, he'd be in slave country again and no more show for freedom. All of these, I think, issue these comments about the fragility of freedom, the process, the fact that freedom is a process repeated without resolution or endpoint over and over again. These statements, we was free and safe once more. It did seem so good to be free again. I would steal Jim out of slavery again. Now, old Jim, you're a free man again, and you won't ever be a slave no more. And then at the bottom, what did you want to set him free for? Huck asks Tom, seeing he was already free. And these statements, I think, all push us to the ending of the novel, the very open-ended ending of the novel, this conundrum that Cable mentions so much and that Twain picks up on in this, just in this way that we're talking about, the conundrum of freed, not free, setting a free man free, that's expressed repeatedly in the different dialects, the voices, you can see it in those lines that we just looked at, the different voices that we've come to know so well over the course of the novel, they all point, I think, to the language of race, then and now, from the minstrelsy that so many readers hear in Jim's Slave Talk, to James. And I think this is, again, we've arrived at the same provisional point that James picks up on and perhaps ends on as well. A provisional ending that ends without closure and closes without resolution. We look toward April and May with James. Vilashini, I
Thank
think
you.
we're ready for our conversation.
I think so. Thank you so much, Susan, um, for giving us so much to think about. And I want to just point to some of the things that you've put into our conversation. You have reconstructed, reassembled Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens' world, including the the historical forces that he is within and contending, including the social discourses around race, around the Civil War, around the period of Reconstruction that he is part of. Very importantly, the literary network system that he is also writing within and through that assemblage of things like folk tales from the African American tradition, historical romances from a romanticizing the Old South point of view, um, things that are severely critical of slavery. And so you reconstruct for us what I would say is a kind of polyphonic or multiply voiced world within which this single text, Adventures of Huck Finn, is emerging. And that is really the work in literary criticism of being a historicist, of taking a historical approach to literature. And it's one thing that we hope to bring to our reading of Percival Everett's James. I couldn't help but be struck in listening to you about this question of the impossibility of freedom in the end of the novel and the the partly open, partly closed, neither here, neither gone quality of freedom in the novel. It seems to me that that tragically is the very landscape we still inhabit. And here we might think of William Faulkner's famous phrase, with slavery, this is the past that isn't done. It's the past that isn't even past.
Past is not dead, it's not even past.
Exactly. It's not even past. And so James's novel is entering this world um, in which that past must be reanimated. Because how do we think the possibility of freedom now without returning to the past that is not even past yet? So could you say a little bit maybe about the parallels between Samuel Clemens, should we call him Clemens or Twain? Twain, I guess.
It's so funny. He was called Mark.
Oh, well, we can call him
Isn't
Mark.
that by his friends, and by his circle.
Okay. Well, so I'm interested in the parallels and the differences between Mark taking in the 1880s this backwards glance to slavery, right?
Hmm.
Even though he is living very much in the period of Reconstruction, and to Percival Everett taking a similar backwards glance in 2024 to this period. What is each figure, do you think, trying to work out with this backwards gaze?
I think that is such a good question because they aren't even exactly looking at the same period. They're looking at and that's one of the, I think, the great radical experiments that Percival Everett conducts in James is to pick up on uncompleted projects in both in Huck Finn itself, and then Huck Finn is picking up on the uncompleted revolution of Reconstruction. And what is uncompleted at each of these moments is where I think what you're asking about.
Yes, yes.
I hope that we will get to fill in the timeline of, the last 10 to 20 years now. What is it that's happening to freedom in the United States, to the language of freedom, to the literature of freedom, but especially to the legal situation of freedom that's different from Twain's. And for us, I mean, one thing I would say is they did not focus on the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Amendment, in the way that we are. And that is one thing I would say, birthright citizenship, everyone knows what's being discussed, but there's been a lot of attention to the 14th Amendment and who it applies to, the connection to immigration for over the last, let's say, 5 years. So I think that's one of the keys is the uncompleted revolution of the 14th Amendment. So if people, that's very important. Um, it was picked up in the later 19th century by corporations claiming the right. that same right. Uh, so, okay, that's I think it's in part that uncompleted work in relation to the 14th Amendment for Percival Everett. He has many wonderful things that he does actually say about the novel itself, but that's the unfinished business for us, I think, is that. The
Mm,
unfinished business for Twain was all three of them, but especially the 13th because it abolished slavery. It did not confer emancipation. That's why you had to have all the other two plus the other cases. The,
right.
the, the legal process is always an uncompleted process.
That's
Laura?
interesting. I wonder if if we could talk about the novel itself in this in the context. And I mean, you mentioned Tom Sawyer's evasion, or these wild, adventurous plans where he really, well, he's planning to emancipate Jim, but really he's like keeping him imprisoned. And you had mentioned like the influence of romances and books, history books, and all this reading material that Tom Sawyer is really immersed in and is trying to sort of live out.
Yeah.
So we have like reading and reading's influence on the one hand, and we have this. I mean, it's so interesting thinking about your comment about the fragility of emancipation, because at some level, freedom, let's just go with freedom, is a sort of given in the novel, oddly. Just stay with me here.
Oh,
And
that's good.
and it's withheld. Like it's like this given. We find out, of course, that Jim is free, right? He's already free, and this is something that Tom Sawyer withholds.
Hmm.
But he has this whole adventure game that he turns his emancipation into.
Mhm.
And just rereading it, I mean, every time I read this book, I'm like, it's something that I think we talked about earlier. Toni Morrison calls perverse, you know, um, and it's so disturbing, that he turns Jim's life and freedom into an adventure based on like adventure tales. Um, so I guess the what I would love to hear you talk about is why is he doing this? You know, and I guess how does this sort of, as I read it, sort of freedom as game or adventure fit within
Yeah.
this larger point you're making that I think is really interesting about the fragility of freedom or freed not free. Um, does that make sense
Hmm.
as a question?
That is such a deep question because it turns on Tom Sawyer, who is Twain himself said to his friend, the editor William Dean Howells, that after he finished Tom Sawyer, he had a really good idea, which was um, to have a character, namely Huck, tell his own story in the first person. Didn't want to do it with Tom because it wouldn't work. So whenever Tom is speaking, he's doing exactly what you're saying. He is the one for whom freedom is a given or
Hmm.
an assumption. The rest of the novel, I think Huck is constantly talking about here we are on the raft, free once more. What
Right, right.
he uses the word Huck uses the word free a lot.
Hmm. Hmm.
Jim also does.
Mhm.
And Tom, I think your point about freedom being assumed and almost a silence around it
Hmm.
is really right for most of the talk of the novel. Only only rarely, that's why I gave that big slide. Rarely do you get that word at all,
Hmm.
free. So there is something about the inability to name it because
Hmm.
it wasn't that Twain is I think working with, and not saying playing with, Twain is working with someone in the way that we also talked earlier about Toni Morrison being interested in silences.
Hmm.
The unsaid, her essay, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, that I mentioned, she's just as interested in what can't be said and what you learn from it
Hmm.
as so in what's withheld. And so that the perversity of Tom doing that is the way we're pushed toward that freedom, free, not free. That
Hmm.
you can't really say more about freedom than putting it with its opposite.
Right.
And of course, even just what else were you thinking about? It was the
Oh,
um,
the way that sort of Tom Sawyer's own reading sort of mediates James and Jim's here experience of freedom, or how his proximity to it, or even his knowledge of his own freedom that he could claim, you know.
I mean,
Um,
that's also
Mm.
Velocity. Are you
Yeah,
thinking about
yeah,
that same
I
question?
I am because I'm thinking about there's a way in which Tom Sawyer's perspective on
Mm-hmm.
freedom, which is constructed through his excessive reading and replaying of adventure plots, being a pirate, being
Yeah,
a highwayman, being a
yeah,
robber, et
yeah.
cetera, et cetera. Um, that is the lens through which he sees this um, sort of amorphous category of freedom that you're so right,
Mm-hmm.
Susan, doesn't fully congeal in the novel, even though it's evoked all over the place. And so I think we want to ask ourselves, what does it mean that the
Mm.
predominant perspective of this novel, which we see through Huck's eyes, and I think in some senses closely allied with that through Huck seeing through Tom Sawyer's eyes, those are perspectives that let us see freedom in a particular way. This is, I think, part of why Huck Finn has such moral conflicts about freedom. Am I doing good when I help Jim to escape, or am I actually doing bad? Um, and it's a larger world in which that is a question about how to relate, right, to the fundamental imperative of freedom. It's not a given, as you said. And I think there's a way in which the novel's perspectives through these childlike narrators
Yeah.
and through the withholding from us of Jim's own perspective. We don't have a lot of interior access to him. His language, as we know, is given to us in very specific ways. So is there something about what I'm calling the perspectival construction of the novel that also kind of forces us to get at freedom and to get at Jim in very particular ways? Could you talk about that?
Often, yes, definitely. Often orthogonal ways where you're getting at Jim from a diagonal. You're never getting directly there. So bringing up that Huck's sense of his own moral failure
Mhm.
in deciding twice in the novel uh, to go with Jim rather than with his conscience, as he calls it. Those are two moments. They're very famous moments. One is early on where um, Jim is right in front of Huck, and Huck is thinking about turning him in and doesn't want to. And it's in part Jim's own language, the way Jim talks, that makes Huck understand what he can't do. The later one, which is that famous chapter 31, all right then, I'll go to hell. It is often said that readers love it because Jim isn't there at all anymore. It's
Mm.
just a memory.
Mm.
And Huck recreates Jim's own language in that of his own.
Yeah.
And it's this moment where that term freedom matters less than the language of his father figure, as we were
Mhm.
also talking about earlier. And
Mhm.
so it's all happens inside of Huck. And so, as Velashini and Laura are pointing out, you get almost nothing of Jim's interiority. It's all circuited diagonally or orthogonally or, in a strange, it, like a funhouse mirror through Huck. And I think what happens with that is Everett picks up on that in this just amazing way by starting with the language of race differently from the way Huck Finn does. He's interested in dialects too, but what James does is it starts by showing you that that Missouri Negro dialect that Twain uses is something that's put on for the massa. It isn't what the way slaves speak to each other.
Mhm.
It's completely strategic. And that I think is one of the, I think most every reader recognizes that's one of the most radical aspects of a James
Mhm.
is that everyone speaks standard English, whether it's inflected by where they come from or who they are in the novel, but everyone, including all of the slaves, speak standard English.
Mm.
And that's the novel that is what the language of the novel. It's not code switching.
Exactly. Well, and
Yeah.
we could say that one of the things that James is doing, Percival Everett's James is doing,
Mhm.
is trying to precisely go into that space that Huck Finn cannot go, which is to say into Jim, but also to reveal rather than a singular sort of true and native,
Essential
authentic,
voice.
essential voice of Jim, to
Yes,
show us that in fact, in this world, Jim and the other enslaved people are unbelievably savvy, canny
exactly.
masters of
Mhm.
linguistic play, and know how to turn it on and turn it off. And so it's really interesting, I think, to to think about the ways in which the language of the novel is both a prison house,
Yeah.
and this is one way to think about its rehearsal of the very languages of racist appellation or naming, and the language, especially as it's taken up by James, becomes a kind of resistance. And so that pairing, I think maybe you could talk a little bit about why, for our readers, it's so important to have a sense of Huck Finn in order to understand just what terrain the novel James kind of takes up residence in.
I really think that there's one small way that I could answer that, and that is most readers of James love in the first few pages, you hear the language lesson that he gives to his family. And it keeps insisting that they need to make sure to translate properly, using that word
Mm.
over and over again, that the daughter needs to translate her response to the white mistress properly into full on Black Massa talk.
Mm.
And Twain has his own version of that. I would love to hear what readers think of it. It's he and Jim have again, it's a minstrel show like exchange between them where one is like Zip Coon and one is like the other figure in the minstrel show.
Mhm.
It's about speaking French.
Oh yeah.
And it is it has so many minstrel echoes.
Mm.
I think that is so rich for James because several things to say. One is they make fun, the Duke and the Duff and the Duke and the King are made fun of as Bilgewater. Huck
Mhm.
mispronounces their names. Bilgewater, they mispronounce them. And the Dolphin, which is the mispronunciation of Dauphin, which he's supposed to be the long lost Louis XVI heir. And so some of the humor is about French is aimed at the white speakers, but just as much that question of in Huck Finn of translating um, language and French leads to the minstrel show problem. And what I think is the most important connection between Huck Finn and James, the minstrel show series of chapters in James, where James is impressed into service
Mhm.
by, one of the times that he is being resold back into slavery. It's freed, not free,
Mhm.
in the Virginia Minstrels, which was a real minstrel troupe run by the Daniel Emmett, who is in the novel, in James. This episode is the longest of a single idea in James. It covers book one and book two, it goes from the end of book one to book two, and it has the most striking free, not free, the elusiveness of freedom and the value of freedom, I think, of almost all of the novel. It's
Mhm.
where they're marching up the street in the little one-horse town, and James thinks to himself, one side is free and one side is not, and you can't tell.
Mhm.
Right.
And it's the closest you can come to that idea of free, not free, being cheek by jowl next to each other. And it's only there, when you're on right in between them in that no man's land, that that the urgency of
Mhm.
freedom as
Mhm.
a missing link is absolutely impossible to ignore. And I feel like the end of the novel of James, which has a
Oh,
similar,
don't, no
I know,
spoilers.
yes, trigger warning, yes, we can't hear that, but it's typical of me.
But I guess I just wanted to say to our audience, I'm so glad that you raised the question and the performative space of minstrelsy in the novel and the ways in
Oh,
which that ties into negotiations of language and dialect, because in our upcoming faculty salon, we'll be speaking with a professor of history and a professor of music, and going more deeply into what Susan called the in-between zone of minstrelsy and the ways in which it afforded an exploration of the kind of delicate and also very harsh lines between states of freedom and unfreedom, and how it
yes.
represented, various kinds of resistant play, occupation from within, but also a tradition that has been read and certainly exists as stereotype. And so one of the things, that novel asks us to wrestle with is how can a stereotype be that?
Yes.
And how can it also be something that opens up to another kind of critique? So I think these are such complex and important questions, and we are going to come back to them. I wonder, Laura, if you and I might start opening this up to our audience and pulling some questions from the
Yeah.
chat.
Yeah. I have one here that is a kind of, I think this segue would be interesting. Um,
Mm,
so this is a question from Serena, and you mentioned, Susan, the stillness and death.
yes.
These
The culture
passages
of
that are
death.
suffused with it. But her question, well, there's a comment about stillness and death and these mourning passages being some of
Hmm.
her favorite parts of the novel.
Oh,
Um, and she's asking if you have any thoughts about grief in the book, like what is grieved or not grieved. Um, and I want to say, just to add on to this, which was occurring to me in our last sort of exchange, that when we moved from Huck Finn to James, I don't see stillness in the same way, or stillness or silence. And
oh,
in many ways, the silences of the violence of slavery, its sort of direct representation, are sort of filled in a way that we don't get them in Huck Finn. They're sort of alluded to, they're threats, but I, I, I mean, I need to read it like five more times, but I don't think it's there in the same way. So I think this is an interesting question for Huck Finn, and then thinking, forward to James as well. Like the question, does it disappear or not there? We can save, but what do you think about this question of,
let me talk about Serena's question about
yeah.
grief, because that's such a good, it's the one word that I hadn't associated with this. But of course, that is what Huck is grieving in this very generalized way, the absence of a family,
Hmm.
the women, it's often said that the world of Huck Finn is a world of women, and the widower Douglas, and
Right.
his father Pap, the dreadfulness of Pap. And I think that he is grieving all those on thumbnail autobiographies where his family is sick or dead.
Hmm.
It's that. It's the childlike quality. The child in him is a sad child, a
Hmm.
mournful child, an unprotected child. And I think that word grief is a really excellent one. That is what that historian Drew Gilpin Faust is talking about with the culture of
Hmm.
death, that they were all caught up in the dreadful, in the incredible number of people that died in the Civil
Hmm.
War, and in the effort to remember them. There was interest in spiritualism,
Hmm.
occultism. Twain himself, thought about seances. Also, children died more frequently. There was higher infant mortality. So there's a lot of that, I think, in the novel. Then just to go from Serena's question to what Laura was saying about the kind of the missing violence in Huck
Hmm.
Finn. One thing I really noticed once I read James is that the Phelps plantation, that other little
Yes.
one horse
Yes.
town where you hear the wailing um, spinning wheel, in James, it's the sawmill, and there
Hmm.
is a sawmill connection in Huck Finn, but you don't hear anything about it, and it's one of the most violent episodes in James, where James is again sold to another owner
Hmm.
and is jumps down into this trough where they use a saw that's so old that body parts get accidentally on purpose
Hmm.
cut off. And it's the brutality of slavery that Twain just doesn't at all touch. You could say that that's why the Huck Finn narrative, why he's the narrator. He doesn't see it either.
Hmm.
That's interesting.
So that's the double-edgedness of that wonderful, that we're in touch with the language of race in an absolutely, unprotected way in Huck Finn, but it's a child's. And so it's grieving language, it's sad language. And this also leads to, we won't give this away, but James is given a role in relation to Huck by Percival Everett that is so interesting in relation to the grief
Absolutely.
over a missing family.
Right. And
Hmm.
that's another one of the sort of picking up a thread from this older text and reweaving it into really a different kind of
A
story.
really
Um, there are some questions in the chat about uh, some of the influences on Twain in terms of how and why he wrote. And I was thinking about this in part because of the tremendous difference between the whole genre of abolitionist writing that precisely did show the brutality of slavery and
yeah.
the difference between adopting Huck's childlike combination of innocence and looking away at various points. He said, I don't want to talk about or describe this part of the story. It's just too sad. So, obviously
Mhm.
there are different periods. So could you talk a little bit? Somebody, Patricia, wants to know, what influenced Twain in his life so that he questioned the culture in which he grew up. He would have been, close to the time of slavery. And what made it possible for him to describe in writing
This is good.
bravely for this time and also obscurely the ambiguity of freedom from slavery? A wonderful question.
Patricia's question, almost has its own answer inside of it. That the language that Twain uses, which I'm not sure where it came from in terms of his own slaveholding past, but the language that he uses is simultaneously um, hiding and revealing, hiding in plain sight, that kind of thing. There are arguments that um, by a scholar who says, was Huck black? And meaning that he had a close, uh, a, he knew a young black child who he wrote about in an 1874 story. So, an early story, who he who he liked and whose language he enjoyed. And so it's some, in a kind of crude way, the question is, is Huck's language all based on what Twain understood to be Black speech? Well, I don't really like the idea of an essential Black voice in that way. I think you really need to think of Twain as growing up in this a very small family of, I think they owned three slaves. And they were not, his father was a lawyer and a judge who did frequently rule on the kinds of cases that would have eventually produced those the Plessy versus Ferguson kind of case. So he was used to hearing the legal talk. His father died when he was very young, and he had to go to work. And he was a good writer. And although he was not well educated, he became a newspaper writer. One of his brothers started Orion, had newspapers in Hannibal. And so I think in part it was Twain's own exposure to this broader writing in his own town. And then he went out to California. I don't know how many people know that. The influence, another, just to, for Patricia, he loved travel narratives. And that wasn't one of those ones that I mentioned, the romances, but that was what, Life on the Mississippi is a travel narrative. He wrote one about the Holy Land as Innocents Abroad, and that was 1860, and he was very successful with that travel narrative. And then Roughing It, which is about his sojourn out west. He wrote for the Alta California, the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise. He had a broader view. And as far as I think he was influenced also by all of those novels that I was trying to talk about. He didn't necessarily know all of them, but he lived in the same world that we do, where you hear all about these things. You don't have
Mhm.
to have read something to have heard of it. And he was in that way influenced by all of those, from the medieval, which he hated, Sir Walter Scott, to George Washington Cable, who, although he went on the lecture tour with him, he was not influenced really by that novel, The Grandissimes, which didn't get Cable into trouble because he thought that it was a kind of just a kind of sanitized apology written by the favorite son of New Orleans for for slavery. He wasn't. Then the final one, I'd say, that's why I mentioned I wanted you to see that mansion that he lived in, 351 Farmington. His wife's family, and his wife particularly, they were very well-known abolitionists in upstate New York. And that was also part of the formation. I mean, he was older. He was married in 1870, and he was born in 1835. So I'm trying to think of all the influences. That's such a good question. I tried very hard to stay away from too much biography, but I'm very happy to get that kind of question.
Yeah. There's another one, maybe, but from Ron Johnson that is also in this vein, and then maybe we'll shift from
And
the biography back into the formal aspects of the text, and people have several questions. Ron Johnson asks that thinking about the novel as a product of the post-Reconstruction period, I remember that Twain actually began the book during Reconstruction, then got stuck for
oh my God.
8 years, then finally finished it after Reconstruction. What influence do you think the political changes after 1877 had
Oh,
on Ron asks on the beginning of the novel, but perhaps you could talk about many effects on the novel?
I am real, everyone always says, oh, that's a great question. I'm genuinely saying I had a whole slide where I talked about that famous interrupted composition that Ron Johnson is talking about. He started in 1876, the year he finished Tom Sawyer, but also 1876 is the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, which preceded the end of Reconstruction the very next year. It was an election that ended in a draw, and they agreed that Hayes would be the the president, but the South would he was the more liberal one, but the South would go to home rule. So 1876 was very important. 1883 was where he wrote. So the X first third was written in 1876. And then you get to a hiatus until 1883. And and then the book is published in 1885. So try to answer Ron Johnson's question, 1883 was the year of the court cases that I mentioned. And of course, Twain was interested in the law in part because of his father, but also you'll all, remember, um, I don't even know if you do, there's a novel called Pudd'nhead Wilson, the comedy Pudd'nhead Wilson, the tragedy Pudd'nhead Wilson, and the comedy Those Extraordinary Twins. It was written in the next decade, and it ends in a trial. Prince and the Pauper does too. So he was very interested in the law. So those cases, those were something that he would have been aware of. 1883 was also when he went back on the Mississippi. And
Right.
many scholars do think that experience going to the Mississippi in the 1880s unleashed for him the sensibility that he already had when he started in 1876, in this post-Reconstruction moment, that what he was really interested in was 1840s as a screen where he could hide. He could project onto that screen of the past the conundrum, the violence, the legalization of slavery that was occurring economically, socially, legally in his period. Legally, that would be ending in Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, which, as we all know, that was not overturned until 1954. Brown v. Board of Education.
Mhm.
He was aware long before 1896 that this was happening. They all were, in the sense that these things were all, their lower court rulings were occurring. But also in 1883, he got the idea, right, going back on the Mississippi, that he would be looking for a way to project onto the past and therefore hide, obscure, usefully what he
Mm.
really wanted to talk about, which was this process of legal and also extra legal violence. The KKK is famous for having been invented in the early days of Reconstruction, when there were no longer the slave codes regulating um, the behavior of Black slaves. And during Reconstruction, there were two congressional investigations of the KKK, and various laws passed to control them that called the Force Acts. And this in 1877, only a few years later, there's a resurgence of that Klan, which had temporarily been stamped out in the beginning of Reconstruction, a resurgence of it in lynchings.
Mhm.
And Twain's is has that word is not used as much in Huck Finn as it is in James.
Right. I'm
You go
wondering if
back
we
to
can,
that. So those are the influences, I think,
yeah.
and 1885 would be that the Twins of Genius tour. See, 1884-5, where Twain, that's what he finished. The summer of 1883 is when he finished it all, but it's published, and he really perfects, from his perspective, those last 12 chapters, once he's on the tour doing
Mhm.
that reading with Cable. So I think that tour is very important, and it's a little bit under, people talk about it just on a timeline, but it's under recognized as having had some influence on
Mm.
the novel, which that was the pre-publicity tour.
That's very interesting. I'm
Want to
wondering if
go
we can
back to
make,
the book itself?
I'm wondering if could make a hard turn. Um, it's not totally a hard turn, but we have several
Go ahead.
questions from the audience about teaching the book and
Go
about
ahead.
pedagogy. And I know this is important for our audience too. We have lots of teachers. I know there are students in high school reading it. I'm going to teach the book, teach Huckleberry Finn in the spring. We have community colleges reading it, getting ready for James. Um, and there's one particular question from Damon that I'd like to zero in on. And Damon says that he's a high school teacher in LA.
Hmm.
And he taught the book for several years in AP Lit and AP Comp classes. That he would spend a lot of time with historical context, setting up the book well,
Yeah.
bringing in outside speakers, and particularly talking about Twain's purpose in using the language that he uses. So, we should talk about that too, the language. Um, but he says he eventually stopped teaching it. Um, Despite his efforts, he says African American students told him that they appreciated his efforts, but still found the book and the experience of studying the book uncomfortable. This is something that, I don't think Damon is alone, in that particular perspective. And I'm wondering do you have any advice for teachers teaching the book, how to approach the novel, or what do you do in this situation, right? Um,
I think I mean I can answer that in so many different ways. Just taking the biggest picture of it, I think teaching, Vilashini and I have spoke about this beforehand, teaching the conflict
mhm,
that the language raised then in its ungrammatical, because the banning then,
right.
teaching the conflict that the language is enshrining, memorializing, courting is probably the the best way into it because there has been so much attention to the language of the novel all along.
Hmm.
Banning of it in, again in 1885 for the ungrammatical coarseness, the banning of it in 1985 by parents, primarily Black parents, also white parents, banning it from secondary school curricula. And Damon is talking about AP English, right? And so
Hmm.
that it went to that kind of discussion in 1985. And then now I think we're getting something about with James and the way Percival Everett is also violating the way there is a famous statement by a series of Black writers that I could find and post for us, all of whom say the same thing that Damon is talking about, that it just makes them too uncomfortable, too conflict. There's an argument to be said for that.
Hmm.
So I'm sure you all noticed I never used the word, I didn't use the euphemism. I tried not to at all because I don't know our audience. I think you need to be in front of people
Hmm.
and looking at them and understanding them um, at a different level of a different educational level. You may think about asking the students, what do they want to do about it? But you've already required the book. That's why parents want it to be taken off required reading lists, but not necessarily from libraries. We are now in a situation, for points on our timeline now, where the books are being banned from libraries themselves.
Yeah.
And we certainly could talk about that in April and May.
Hmm.
And
And I think that Abigail in the chat has a really helpful sort of addition and follow-up to what we've just been discussing, which is so important. Abigail says, you've talked about the deconstruction or showing the inner logic of something that Twain's novel accomplishes with the tension between freed, not free, and the ways those are entwined. She continues, in terms of the unique discourse of race that Twain's novel creates, Do you think
Mm,
that the N word, which appears 213 times, is also deconstructed and destabilized too? If so, why is this important for a critical and, in the classroom, pedagogical understanding of race, identity, meaning making, and reading? And she asks, should we be
mm,
teaching this novel through certain theories of language, whether it be those of deconstruction or citationality, the ways in which repetition always happens with a difference, with an air perhaps to performativity, and what the ways in
mhm,
which what happens in dialect happens also in minstrelsy,
mhm.
in James. I think we can think of so many other kind of lenses that we can bring to read these phenomenons, not as singular and stable,
Yeah.
right? And so maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
I think the idea of um, Abigail's idea of teaching the novel through theories of language is really interesting. I think you could, what I would be the most interested in is theories of translation,
Hmm.
because both the novels feature that as their way into the destabilizing of the language that's used, period, all over the place, and definitely the racist language as well. I think that, I'm not sure her question about do we think that's also destabilized? That is, my answer would probably be something like the open-endedness, that there's something about the repetition
Mhm.
of that word in different ways across the
Hmm.
novel where I think you probably could, it would be very repulsive to do it, but I think you could track each one of those 220 and look at them closely. And it is Tom Sawyer uses it quite a lot. Huck
Hmm.
Finn, of course, does too. But that one of the statements at the end of the novel that I think might be helpful for Abigail is it's Tom who says in all those freed, not free comments, the word man is used almost always
Mhm.
to refer to Jim. There is one time later when it's not, but I didn't read, but Tom says he's not a slave. He's as free as any cretur, any creature. It's a phonetic. He's as free as any creature that ever walked this earth. Well, what a wild, ironic. For him, it's referring to Jim as an animal, not calling him an animal, but pretty closely a creature. And that's the closest that Tom Sawyer can come to getting away from the language, the racist language.
Hmm.
And I think that there's something about that last evasion, which is so dreadful,
Mhm.
that maybe goes back to what Laura, was talking about. How can the Tom Sawyer play of the evasion be the very moment where you finally find out, that Jim is already free? What happens
Right.
to freedom under that kind of regime? I somehow feel like Abigail's question is helping you think about the novel as a form, all these novels as forms of translation. And
Hmm.
Toni Morrison does, I don't need to quote all of this, but Toni Morrison does in her essay that's written in the 1980s, this and during, the 100th birthday of Huck Finn, when book banning occurred again. Toni Morrison's essay, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, is about the ghost in the machine of American literature, which is this missing link, the thing that's haunting American literature, which is the Afro-American presence in
Hmm.
American literature. And she says, well, if our literature is mostly white, well, what makes a work black? And she puts it in quotes, and she says it's language. And she just says, I think this will help us to answer. Um, it's the most freighted point of entry to the question, what makes a work black? In quotes, it's not the identity of the writer. It's the language. The most valuable point of entry into that question, the one most fraught, most complex, most conflicted, um, is its language. It's unpoliced, seditious. We think about sedition a lot these days. Seditious, confrontational, manipulative, inventive, disruptive, masked, and unmasking language. And
Mm.
I feel like that might be the only thing to say, that to bring together Twain and James, um, and to address our problem of what do you do with a novel that uses language that's repellent and was even repellent when Twain used it in the
Hmm.
1880s. Polite people didn't use that word.
Right. Which is a reason it was censored early in the early days, right?
They,
It
well,
was sort of uncouth language. It
they
was,
uncouth, but
yeah.
they really were worried more about the lack of grammar, the
And
backbone
smoking
behavior,
wasn't, smoking was
Laura.
a problem.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, the uncouth behavior. But
Yeah.
you be very right, and I have not. They weren't worried about the position on slavery,
Hmm.
but the uncouth language and that word,
And that children, and that it was in the
a
voice of,
boy's book. I mean,
yeah,
a children's book.
right. I have an
There's Maya's question. I can see your.
yeah, it was, I think it would be interesting to seg to that quickly. I mean, and it's speaking to this, the uncouthness or the low class character of Huck, right? And so class becomes this really interesting important context, but also lens, really, positionality in which, like, back to your point, I mean, it's very different when Tom Sawyer says something and then Huck Finn says something. Um, and Maya's asking, well, it's a comment really that she said she saw Huck's positionality as a poor white boy, son of an alcoholic and later orphan,
Yeah.
is really key to the story. Um, and interested to see how this plays out in James, but also how it's really structures the narrative of Huck Finn itself and his relationship with Jim.
Well, the
Oh,
last
wait,
name,
you're
you're
muted,
muted.
Balaji.
Go ahead.
Could just tag on one thing to that as we're close to time, and maybe Susan, both these questions are in the spirit of a mini reading alert or series of beacons marking people's path into James. So I think absolutely this question about class and positionality and what happens to the characters of Twain's novel when they are uploaded into Everett's novel
Oh,
is
that's so
one.
good.
And then I think equally important is the question of what happens to the language of Twain's novel when uploaded into Everett's novel. And what do you want readers to pay attention to as they start to think comparatively about what is done with language and dialect in across the two texts, because I think we're looking at Huck Finn in
Mm.
order to prepare ourselves to be able to read James more deeply. So both, yeah, if you can.
Yes. Uh, First of all, just I think if people keep those questions in mind, if our all of our readers, that is what happens when I like Velashini's verb uploaded, what happens to the kind of class markers of that are present mostly in terms of Huck and a kind of lower class, the Duke and the King are well read, but they are mocked. There's
Mhm.
no real their sense of Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare. I mean, there's no real representation of anything beyond. You can see it from the what he's comments and what the author comments in the dialects explanatory. They're mostly they're languages of lower class people.
Mhm.
That's what he's talking about. James, I think, does something that some readers can't wrap their minds around, which is it's very educated. The way the experiment in language takes place when it's uploaded, when dialect is uploaded into James, is it becomes his language becomes very rarefied. At one point, Vilashini said to me, "The King's English," and I thought, "Oh, well, it's just standard English." I didn't, but I do think there's something about the class level of the language in James, and of course, the way James thinks to himself, not just talks, but you might look
Right.
for, that is one little beacon would be what is the language of the novel when we're inside a character, not the dialogue, because that can tell you a lot about the positionality of where that novel is without you don't have it's the omniscient voice, and that's one I do think that's really interesting in terms of James. Another one to look at is the beginning, those little prefatory pages, that I was reading, and of course I love them. And anything that's outside of a novel is that on the threshold of a novel. Those are called paratextual elements. The book cover is that. The title of the book is that. It can be dropped. It can be lost. It can be changed. So in James has these amazing, they're little quote, they're squibs from the old minstrel songs of Daniel Emmett. And they are like, I think those are worth the notebook of Daniel Decatur Everett. I
Hmm.
think those are worth they're by and large very racist songs from, old Zip Coon. I think that's worth looking at.
Hmm.
As look at the language in the songs and think about the way James is given a beautiful singing voice. And then maybe later in the spring, I'm always looking, toward our next event in the spring, we could talk about the experiment in minstrelsy is usually called blackface, where the characters black up. And James is forced to black up, and his friend Norman talks about how wild and surreal it is because you can't admit that there's a black person in a troupe, and so they have to make it look like they have to black up too.
Right.
Anyway, um, that blackface is what minstrelsy is usually called as a performative from the pre-Civil War, the pre-emancipation period. But what James does, and I think you could say what Huck does, black voice. It's
Yes.
what it's what later, I hope we'll talk about it. Um, Spike Lee does in 2018 and 2020 with Black Klansman and Bamboozled.
Mhm.
And then really even Percival Everett does it. And the film is American fiction, not until 2022, I think. But the novel that he does it, it's black voice where it's a telephone.
Mhm.
Someone, and that's called Erasure,
Yeah.
that novel.
Right. And thank you so much for weaving together all these influences
The
that we
questions
can.
are
Getting us
wonderful.
ready. Getting us ready. Yeah.
Let's
Absolutely.
give everyone out there. I wish we could all see each other, but let's give everyone out there a giant.
Thank you for being here.
Hearts and
Absolutely. And thank you,
everyone.
Susan, for sharing all of your wisdom and expertise with us.
I
To our
enjoyed it so
audience,
much.
please tune in. We'll be contacting you via email about upcoming aspects of the deep read, reading guides, snippets of various folks' perspectives
There's
on
my
the
slides
novel.
and
Absolutely.
possibly some timelines that you could fill in. We'll figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
Yes, and for those who've asked, you can find the recording on our website in a couple days. And please just check back in order to be an ongoing and active member of our Deep Read community. So welcome, and I look forward to seeing you many times between
Yes.
now and
To
early.
our futures.
Exactly. And if you have more questions about the book, feel free to send them. We can answer them, and we're still thinking about this book and how we bridge between Twain and Everett. And so that conversation will continue. So if you have questions that didn't get answered tonight, please send them to us. We want to address them. We want to hear what you have to say and keep this conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.